May 27, 1941, 0847 hours. 400 miles west of Brest in the brutal North Atlantic, Sea Captain Ernst Lindemann surveyed the devastation from the shattered remnants of the Bismarcks bridge. The vessel, once hailed as the unsinkable, invincible pride of the Kriegsmarine, was now listing perilously to port. Her massive engines were silenced, steering mechanisms destroyed, and uncontrolled fires raged across half her tremendous length. Through the smoke and ocean spray, British battleships materialized, closing the ring from three directions. Around Lindemann, the last functional gun crews fired desperate, wild salvos at spectral shapes barely visible in the choking atmosphere. The response was clinical. British shells arrived in methodical succession, a professional, relentless certainty, one salvo every 20 seconds, each impact drawing closer than the last. Lindemann had commanded the Bismarck for 9 months. He had witnessed her grand launch, heard the fanfare, and seen Hitler himself christen her as the instrument of Germany's new maritime dominance. Gross Admiral Rudder had explicitly promised she would scour British shipping from the Atlantic. The propaganda asserted that Bismarck was not merely a battleship. She was a definitive proof of German engineering superiority, a floating fortress impervious to enemy assault. Just 3 days prior, Lindemann had believed this myth implicitly. His ship had annihilated HMS Hood, the flagship of the Royal Navy, in 8 devastating minutes. A single, fortunate salvo had caused Britain's most famous warship to explode and vanish, taking 1,415 men with her. The crew had erupted in cheers. Berlin had celebrated the confirmation of the ship's invincible status. Now, only 72 hours later, the Bismarck was enduring a slow, agonizing demise under the focused weight of naval artillery. Ships she had been designed specifically to outfight. The British attackers were not driven by haste, but by the same methodical, cold precision that had defined 3 centuries of Royal Navy warfare. A tremendous shell struck the Bismarck's forward structure. Lindemann felt the deck shudder violently beneath his feet. Through the thick smoke and spray, he tracked the massive form of HMS Rodney, adjusting her lethal aim. Her 16-inch main battery guns, tracking with glacial and relentless patience, represented the steady, methodical work of destroying a warship that stubbornly refused to succumb. This catastrophic end was never meant to be the final chapter for Bismarck. Launched in Hamburg on Valentine's Day 1939, this vessel was conceived as Germany's absolute answer to the might of British naval supremacy, a warship so profoundly powerful that its mere presence demanded the Royal Navy fundamentally reorganize its entire Atlantic strategy. Fully loaded, she displaced 53,000 tons and mounted 8 formidable 15-inch guns housed in 4 massive turrets. German engineers had designed her armor protection system to be virtually unsinkable. Her armor belt alone was 310 millimeters thick, a solid foot of hardened steel shielding all vital spaces. Horizontal deck armor was engineered to withstand aerial bombs, while her compartmentalized hull was theoretically capable of surviving multiple torpedo hits. The cold numbers affirmed a story of overwhelming, calculated power. Main armament range extended to 36,000 meters. Secondary batteries comprised 12 5.9-inch and 14 4.1-inch guns, complemented by 16 37M anti-aircraft guns. The belt armor clocked in at 320 millimeters, the deck at 120 millimeters, and the turret faces at 316 millimeters, capable of maximum speed of 30 knots, crewed by 2,200 officers and men, and costing 196.8 million Reichsmarks. She stood as the most expensive naval asset ever constructed by Germany. German propaganda had skillfully crafted the Bismarck into a national legend. Newsreels documented her launch before massive crowds, with Hitler himself presiding over the reviewing stand. Radio broadcasts confidently proclaimed to the ship that cannot be sunk. She was not merely a weapon. The Bismarck stood as a potent, floating symbol of the Third Reich's engineering genius and its perceived military inevitability. Kapitan Hans Rudder, the Bismarck's gunnery officer, encapsulated the intoxicating confidence of the Kriegsmarine in a final letter written to his wife before the ship's maiden combat deployment. "We sail tomorrow for destiny," he wrote. "This ship is a fortress. The British may come with their entire fleet, and we will send them all to the bottom. Germany has finally built a weapon worthy of ruling the Atlantic. Yet, the British Admiralty, digesting intercepted communications and detailed intelligence reports, already grasped the formidable nature of the new German battleship. Crucially, they also held a truth the Germans seem to have overlooked. The North Atlantic had been Britain's sovereign domain for 3 centuries, and ultimate naval superiority was rarely decided solely by armor thickness or the sheer caliber of guns. It was defined by unforgiving seamanship, relentless patience, and the unwavering willingness to hunt an enemy across thousands of miles of open ocean until there was nowhere left to run. This fundamental clash of doctrine culminated in the shocking death of HMS Hood on May 24, 1941. In the frigid, turbulent waters of the Denmark Strait, nestled between Iceland and Greenland, Britain's largest and most famous warship intercepted the German task force. Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Hood was a legend, launched in 1918, having spent 2 decades as the Royal Navy's global flagship, touring the world as a potent symbol of imperial naval power. Sailors had affectionately dubbed her the Mighty Hood. She was fast, elegant, and carried 8 formidable 15-inch guns that had maintained her status as the most powerful warship afloat for over 20 years. But her design harbored a fatal vulnerability: thin deck armor. Conceived in an era when naval battles were fought at close quarters, where shells struck horizontally, this protection was rendered catastrophically obsolete by 1941 technology, which allowed guns to fire up to 30,000 meters, sending shells plunging vertically onto vulnerable decks. Hood's defense held only if the enemy remained close. The engagement commenced at 5:52 hours, at a range of... The initial engagement commenced at approximately 26,000 meters, with both sides opening fire within minutes. Though British shells fell around the Bismarck, several striking true, they failed to penetrate her formidable, heavy armor plating. Conversely, German shells straddled Hood, the impacts walking closer with every salvo. At precisely 0600 hours, the Bismarck's 5th salvo struck the battlecruiser amidships. 1 or more shells successfully penetrated the relatively thin deck armor, reaching the main ammunition magazines, resulting in the catastrophic detonation of 100 tons of cordite propellant. The resulting explosion was visible for 20 miles. Hood's structural integrity failed instantly. Her back broke, and her bow and stern lifted simultaneously as the central section disintegrated in a spectacular column of flame and fragmented steel. She sank in less than 3 minutes, taking 1,415 men to the bottom, all but 3 of her 1,418-man crew. The watching German sailors could scarcely believe the speed of destruction. 1 salvo, 1 fatal penetration, and Britain's proudest warship had simply vanished. Aboard the Bismarck, the crew erupted in wild cheering. They had fulfilled German propaganda's promise, shattering the very symbol of British naval dominance in a single morning. Berlin would celebrate, and the Führer would be pleased, believing Bismarck had proven herself invincible on her first day of combat. However, aboard HMS Prince of Wales, Hood's escort which had withdrawn after sustaining damage, the atmosphere was one of profound, shocked silence. Officers and men stared at the expanding patch of burning oil where Hood had been. Quietly, they began making meticulous preparations, sending contact reports, shadowing the German battleship and awaiting reinforcements. The British were not panicking. They were calculating, and their calculation was chillingly simple. By sinking the Hood, the Bismarck had merely signed her own death warrant. The news of Hood's immediate destruction reached London within hours, delivering a profound shock to a nation that regarded the battlecruiser as far more than just a ship. She was a floating monument. The sinking of HMS Hood represented more than the loss of a warship. It was a destruction of a tangible piece of Britain itself, the very embodiment of imperial naval power for a generation. When Winston Churchill received the devastating report at his country residence, Chequers, he processed the implications instantly. Setting the dispatch down, the Prime Minister issued a chillingly simple directive that would mobilize virtually every effective capital ship the Royal Navy possessed in the Atlantic. Sink the Bismarck. This was not merely an act of vengeful retribution. It was a strategic imperative, an existential necessity for the beleaguered island nation, A warship of Bismarck's caliber operating unchecked in the Atlantic posed an immediate, devastating threat. She possessed the potential to shatter the vital convoy system, annihilate escorts, and force a complete, crippling reorganization of Britain's shipping protection. Every merchant vessel carrying the essential food and supplies, the very lifeline sustaining Britain's war effort, stood vulnerable to her guns. Furthermore, the blow to national morale and naval prestige demanded an immediate, overwhelming response. The Royal Navy could endure battle losses, but allowing an enemy capital ship to sink its flagship and then escape unscathed to occupied ports was an intolerable humiliation. The unequivocal order radiated instantly from the Admiralty. Every available vessel must converge immediately on Bismarck's last known position. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and critically, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, then operating hundreds of miles to the south, abandoned their assignments and turned relentlessly toward the operational zone. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from a bridge of HMS King George V, meticulously analyzed the tactical situation. Though Bismarck had crippled the Prince of Wales, she had sustained 3 critical shell hits herself. One of these had ruptured a major fuel tank, leaving a telltale, widening oil slick in her wake. Leaking precious fuel, the German behemoth was now compelled to seek refuge and urgent repairs, meaning her course was fixed. The U-boat havens of Brest or St. Nazaire in German-controlled occupied France. The race was now on. Bismarck was heading south, trying desperately to reach the safety of the Luftwaffe's air cover before the full concentration of British sea power could close the trap. The window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. Admiral Tovey understood that the Royal Navy had perhaps 48 hours to locate Bismarck and force a decisive engagement before she slipped beneath the umbrella of shore-based air cover and coastal defenses. His pursuit fleet was formidable, centered on the battleships King George V and Rodney, both equipped with heavy 16-inch guns capable of matching Bismarck's own firepower. Supplementing this corps with a battlecruiser Renown, the vital carrier Ark Royal, and a powerful screen of multiple cruisers and destroyers. The objective was stark. If they could find the German behemoth, they could destroy her. Yet, the North Atlantic was a void. Weather was rapidly deteriorating, and Bismarck had skillfully utilized heavy fog banks, rendering radar contact intermittent at best. But the British possessed an intangible advantage the Germans had discounted: the cold, institutional patience of the Royal Navy. For 3 centuries, they had hunted enemies across the world's oceans, mastering the arts of tracking, prediction, and waiting for the inevitable moment when geography and fuel state would converge to trap their quarry. They would find Bismarck, and they would complete the hunt that the sinking of Hood had initiated. For 31 critical hours, Bismarck vanished entirely. British cruisers lost radar contact in the heavy swells, and search aircraft returned with nothing but reports of empty ocean. German wireless traffic suggested Bismarck was making for France, but intercepts could not pinpoint her exact location. Tovey's force steamed relentlessly southeast, calculating probable courses, but the ocean was too large and Bismarck too fast. Aboard the German battleship, Admiral Lütjens initiated the critical, fatal decisions. He detached the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen to operate independently. Crucially, he maintained radio silence except for periodic status reports transmitted back to Berlin, transmissions at British direction finding stations meticulously logged and triangulated. He ran at economical speed to conserve fuel tanks damaged in the battle, accelerating his course toward the French coast where Luftwaffe air cover awaited. The crew of the Bismarck may have believed the final approach was secured, anticipating repairs and a swift return to operational status. This illusion of safety was abruptly shattered on May 26th at 10:30 hours. A PBY Catalina flying boat, operated by Coastal Command, detected a crucial telltale, a long oil slick trailing in the vast Atlantic. The pilot meticulously tracked the sheen through broken cloud cover, eventually sighting the German behemoth steaming steadily eastward, still 700 nautical miles distant from protective embrace of French air cover. The critical sighting report was immediately transmitted, and the Catalina began the perilous task of shadowing the battleship. Bismarck's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire instantly, but the lumbering aircraft maintained a safe distance, circling and relaying precise positional updates every 30 minutes. Aboard HMS King George V, Admiral Tovey received a contact report. Plotting Bismarck's course, speed, and projected arrival, Tovey recognized the dire reality. His heavy battleships were positioned too far north. Even at maximum speed, interception was impossible before the German warship reached safety. The only viable option lay with Force H, operating to the south, centered on the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. If her air wing could cripple Bismarck's steering or propulsion, slowing her down sufficiently, Tovey's main striking force could close the distance. The order was dispatched: attack at dusk. As the Ark Royal pitched violently in the heavy Atlantic swell, deck crews prepared 15 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers for launch. These aircraft were relics. Obsolete biplanes designed in the 1930s, constructed of fabric stretched over a fragile frame, slow, and armed only with a single 18-inch torpedo. Mocked by German fighter pilots as flying coffins, the Swordfish seemed a grotesque anachronism of the Second World War. Yet, this very obsolescence provided a unique, critical advantage. Their slow speed rendered them difficult targets for modern, high-speed fire control systems. Bismarck's sophisticated anti-aircraft guns, designed to engage contemporary aircraft. The modern pursuit aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding 300 knots, struggle to maintain formation and aim against the obsolete Swordfish biplanes, which lumbered through turbulent air at a mere 90 knots. The critical strike, launched at 2150 hours, pushed into rapidly deteriorating weather conditions and the onset of evening twilight. Pilots navigate precariously low over the slate-gray waves, relying on dead reckoning in their desperate search for a vessel that was rapidly merging with the darkening expanse of the Atlantic. They achieved contact at 2253 hours. The massive silhouette of the Bismarck suddenly materialized in a veil of persistent rain squalls, immediately unleashing a storm of defensive anti-aircraft fire. The determined Swordfish pilots executed a coordinated maneuver, splitting their formations to attack from multiple vectors, effectively saturating and dividing the German defensive curtain. Tracer fire arced violently across the darkening sky as flak shells detonated around the slow-moving aircraft. One biplane succumbed to hits, dropping away trailing smoke and debris, yet the remaining crews pressed their perilous attack runs. Their torpedoes struck the water, running true toward the immense hull, though the majority either missed or detonated harmlessly against the Bismarck's heavily armored belt. Then came the decisive blow. A torpedo launched by Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett, delivered from an altitude of only 50 meters, struck the Bismarck's stern quarter at 21:15 hours. The resulting explosion violently jammed her complex steering mechanism, locking the rudder hard to port. Below decks, damage control teams fought desperately to restore hydrostatic or manual control, but the rudder remained immovably fixed. The great warship was immediately forced into slow, agonizing circles. Although her powerful engines continued to drive propellers and her primary armament remained operational, she could no longer steer, nor maintain the vital course toward the safety of the French coast, nor maneuver to evade the closing enemy fleet. The Bismarck could only spiral helplessly as British battleships converged from the northwest. Captain Ernst Lindemann stood surveying the chaos from the wrecked bridge, grasping the stark reality. A single improbable hit from an obsolete biplane had catastrophically crippled the ostensibly unsinkable flagship. The strategic mathematics of the pursuit had instantly inverted. Her formidable speed was irrelevant if she could not be directed. Lindemann then composed his final, grim assessment for Berlin. The German crew, knowing their ship was unmaneuverable, prepared to fight to the last shell in the final, desperate battle. Dawn on May 27 arrived, a gray and cold spectacle over heavy, unforgiving seas. Bismarck had spent the night attempting every conceivable repair, struggling fruitlessly to regain steering control. Nothing worked. The crippled giant could only manage slow, agonizing circles, her course drifting generally northwest, away from the safety of France, and directly toward the British forces relentlessly hunting her down. At 8:43 hours, a lookout spotted the ominous mass on the horizon. Minutes later, HMS Rodney and King George V emerged from a morning haze, their main guns already trained forward and crews at battle stations. Admiral Tovey had closed the distance during the night, utilizing radar to meticulously track Bismarck's erratic, disabled course. Now, With the advantage of daylight and optimal tactical positioning, he had secured exactly what he needed. The ensuing mathematics were brutal. 2 fully mobile British battleships against a solitary German warship that could not maneuver or escape. The Allied firepower was overwhelming. 18 heavy guns, 9 formidable 16-inch guns aboard Rodney, and 10 14-inch guns on King George V. Against this stood Bismarck's diminished offense of only 6 operational heavy guns, 2 turrets having been damaged and 1 rendered unmanned. The British possessed full steering control and perfect positioning. The Germans none. Their rudder permanently locked. At 8:47 hours, Rodney initiated the engagement, opening fire from 23,000 meters. King George V followed seconds later. Simultaneously, the heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire closed from the east, adding the concentrated weight of their 8-inch guns. Despite the impossible odds, Bismarck's forward turrets returned fire. Her initial salvos testified to the enduring professionalism of German gunnery. 1 shell landed perilously close aboard Rodney, sending a vast cascade of water across her decks. Yet, skill could not overcome the British advantage in position and numbers. Their shells began to fall in steady, unwavering patterns, walking closer with each salvo. Bracket corrections were called with cold, calculated precision from each ship's fire control station. Once the range was found, the torrent of fire became relentless, and the punishment administered was systematic and methodical. The sustained barrage of British shells tore into Bismarck's superstructure, penetrating vital armor and systematically dismantling her combat capability. Gun directors were destroyed, turrets silenced one by one, and intense fires raged through the upper works. Forward batteries ceased firing, their crews decimated, ammunition hoists wrecked, and targeting systems rendered useless. Despite the catastrophic damage, the crippled battleship fought back with whatever resources remained. Secondary batteries engaged closing cruisers, and anti-aircraft weapons fired desperately as British destroyers pressed into torpedo range. Individual German sailors, driven by professional courage, manned guns manually when automated fire control failed. Admiral Tovey, observing the methodical destruction from the bridge of King George V, maintained a chilling tactical objectivity. There was no room for triumph, only flat assessment. "She's putting up a brave fight," he remarked to his staff, before adding without emotion, "Continue firing." The British felt no hatred for professional German sailors, only respect for their courage and skill against impossible odds. Yet, respect did not translate into mercy. The sinking of HMS had demanded an accounting, and the security of Britain's Atlantic lifeline necessitated the job be finished. For 6 grueling hours, British heavy guns pounded the dying hull. Her speed plummeted to 7 knots. Her list grew steeper, and unchecked fires consumed her decks. The Bismarck's legendary armor and effective compartmentalization proved astonishingly resilient. She could be utterly destroyed, yet she refused to sink by gunfire alone. At 10:15 hours, Tovey made the final, definitive decision: torpedo her. The heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire closed at 3,000 meters and launched its payload, striking the Bismarck's port side with 2 decisive torpedo hits. Dorsetshires' final approach proved decisive. Minutes later, the destroyer launched a spread of torpedoes into the crippled battleship's starboard side, securing a single catastrophic hit. At precisely 10:36 hours, the Great Bismarck began her final, irreversible roll to port. Her surviving crew, knowing the end had arrived, abandoned the sinking hull and plunged into the icy void of the North Atlantic. The colossal vessel capsized completely, momentarily floating inverted before the weight of her structure dragged her stern first into the abyss. A profound quiet descended upon the ocean. British sailors, lining the rails of their victorious ships, stood at rigid attention. There was no sound of cheering. Naval tradition mandated solemn respect for an opponent who had fought with such tenacity. These German sailors had displayed immense courage, yet they had fought a doomed battle in a ship that could not escape its fate. The destroyers Dorsetshire and Maui immediately began the harrowing work of rescue, hauling 110 hypothermic, oil-covered German sailors from the wreckage-strewn, freezing water. This effort was violently curtailed when a chilling blare of confirmed U-boat alarm forced a sudden and brutal withdrawal. The destroyers departed at maximum speed, abandoning hundreds of men still clinging to life in the frigid sea, scattering only 2 smaller vessels to continue the rescue efforts before darkness and worsening weather extinguished all hope. Of Bismarck's complement of approximately 2,200 men, only 114 ultimately survived. The vast majority perished, either drowned, frozen, or pulled under by the weight of their own equipment. Among the few rescued was machinist Bruno Zonker, who had been violently blown overboard by an earlier shell explosion, hauled onto the deck of the Dorsetshire, stripped of his oil-soaked clothing, wrapped in warm blankets, and given hot tea. Zonker sat shivering. He watched the procession of shocked and exhausted young men being brought aboard, unable to reconcile the reality. The invincible fortress had sunk, shattering every belief they held about German naval superiority. The conviction that German strength was paramount and British weakness had proven false. As a British sailor offered Lieutenant Rosona a cigarette, the survivor stared, bracing for the inevitable hatred, the abuse, the expected vengeance for the sinking of HMS Hood. Instead, he met only the weary gaze of a professional. The sailor silently lit Rosona a cigarette, nodded, and turned to assist a stream of other men pulled from the frigid water. Later, during formal interrogation, Rosona was asked to articulate his clearest memory of the Bismarck's final, agonizing hours. He reflected before delivering an answer that defined the battle. The British forces never paused. There was no visible rage or triumphant boasting. They simply maintained their firing cadence, adjusting their sights, working with relentless, cold precision, like solving a complex mathematics problem that admitted only one solution. The Germans had believed their vessel invincible. The Royal Navy had merely treated her as a challenging but ultimately achievable target, another ship that could be sunk through sustained effort. The reckoning arrived in Berlin on May 27, 1941, abruptly interrupting lunch at Hitler's field headquarters. The Führer received the official report in stark silence, reading the dispatch twice before dismissing his staff without a word of comment. German propaganda machinery immediately strained to rationalize the loss, how the supposedly unsinkable ship, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had been annihilated after just 9 days at sea. Radio broadcasts magnified the crew's brave fight, emphasized the damage inflicted on the British fleet, and extolled the heroism of the sacrifice. They meticulously omitted the strategic failure. Bismarck had sunk one capital ship and damaged another, yet had been cornered and destroyed before she could disrupt a single Allied convoy. In London, the victory was met not with gloating, but with a measured gravity. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, asserting that the Royal Navy had once again demonstrated that control of the vital sea lanes could not be wrested away simply by constructing larger ships or applying thicker armor plating. It requires. The ultimate victory hinged upon seamanship, relentless coordination, and a determined willingness to pursue an enemy across thousands of miles of ocean until the mission was conclusively achieved. For the Royal Navy, the sinking of the Bismarck restored something intangible yet absolutely vital, the irrefutable proof that British sea power remained supreme. The loss of the Hood had been avenged, and the operational reality was established. No German capital ship could navigate the Atlantic without facing inevitable pursuit and destruction. Notably, Admiral Tovey's official report refrained from any mention of revenge or triumph. Instead, he acknowledged that the Bismarck had fought a most gallant battle against impossible odds, a performance worthy of the old German Imperial Navy, noting she went down with her colors flying. This professional respect for a brave adversary, even in utter destruction, defined the British naval tradition. Strength lay not in celebratory rhetoric, but in the unwavering maintenance of professional standards. By midday on May 27th, the North Atlantic had swallowed the evidence, returning to its usual desolate, gray vastness. The victorious British ships formed up and set a course back to Scarpa Flow, transferring the few survivors for transport to prisoner of war camps. The ocean closed over Bismarck's grave, concealing her wreck beneath the waves for 48 long years. The German High Command never commissioned another vessel of Bismarck's stature. Her sister ship, the Tirpitz, spent the vast majority of the war immobilized, hiding deep within Norwegian fjords, a massive, inert asset tied down by the mere shadow of the Royal Navy's presence, only to be destroyed eventually by British bombers without ever participating in a major fleet action. The ultimate lesson resonated across the waves. Industrial might alone was insufficient. True naval mastery required seamanship, coordination, patience, and the institutional knowledge forged over 3 centuries of ruling the seas. Germany possessed the steel. Britain possessed the tradition. In the end, that institutional depth proved decisive. The clash between ideology and reality defined the immediate aftermath for the 114 German sailors pulled from the frigid Atlantic. For these survivors, captivity afforded the unexpected time to process the stark difference between Nazi ideological conditioning and the British reality. Many, including Bruno Rosanka, struggled with a profound cognitive dissonance. They had been primed to expect savage, morally depleted opponents, yet encountered disciplined professionals. Instead of anticipated vengeance, they received strictly correct treatment adhering to the established laws of war. A powerful testament to this confusion emerged in a letter penned by one survivor from a Scottish POW camp, attempting to rationalize the experience for his family back home. "We were repeatedly told that the British would be cruel," he wrote, "that their empire was founded on brutality, and that they had lost the moral fiber necessary to fight honorably. Yet, when they rescued me from the sea, they provided blankets and hot tea. During interrogation, they were firm, certainly, but unequivocally fair. We were handled like defeated military personnel, not like common criminals. Their decision to destroy our ship was executed solely as a matter of martial necessity, not driven by malice. This capacity to neutralize a dangerous enemy without descending into wanton cruelty was a strength we in Germany have been fundamentally conditioned to reject and misunderstand." The calendar turned to May 28, 1941. At Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, the great gray bulk of HMS King George V returned to port. Anchored now in the main naval base after 3 days of relentless steaming and 6 hours locked in the violence of battle, the exhausted sailors silently manned her decks, watching the rugged Scottish coastline materialize through the morning mist. There was no celebratory bunting, no expectant crowds lining the pier. The crew understood they had fulfilled a grim obligation. They had tracked the enemy, engaged her in battle, destroyed her, and now they would immediately resume the punishing, endless cycle of convoy protection and Atlantic patrol, the vital work that sustained Britain's war effort. Admiral Tovey stood on King George V's bridge, his gaze sweeping across the assembled home fleet. The victory was definitive, but the cost was unforgettable. The battlecruiser Hood was gone. Even as the remnants of her crew sought rescue in the Denmark Strait, the mighty Bismarck was gone. She had been dispatched to the bottom by the very professional seamanship that had underpinned British command of these critical waters since the age of Nelson. The Germans had conceived a vessel specifically designed to shatter British naval supremacy, crafting her with unprecedented speed, immense power, and formidable armor. They had proudly christened her the new Queen of the Seas, proclaiming her utterly unsinkable. Yet, in their engineering hubris, they had neglected the fundamental truth that the Royal Navy had honed over centuries. Control of the world's oceans is not secured merely by constructing the largest or most powerful ship. True naval mastery demands the relentless patience to hunt, the acute skill to track, and the unwavering determination to finish the task, regardless of the time elapsed or the distance steamed. The Bismarck was certainly powerful. The Royal Navy was inherently relentless. Over 6 hours of methodical, concentrated gunfire, this relentless resolve proved definitively superior to raw, temporary power. The Atlantic, as it always does, rendered the final judgment on who truly ruled its waves. On that cold, gray Atlantic morning, watching the colossal German warship slip irrevocably beneath the surface, the British sailors completed the duty they had executed professionally and without fuss for 300 years. Far below, the Bismarck settled into the abyssal depths, a monument to the pinnacle of German engineering, yet simultaneously a profound testament to enduring British resolve. The surface soon returned to its usual unmarked emptiness, save for the temporary oil slicks and dispersing debris. Nothing remained but a memory and the harsh, indelible lesson that power devoid of strategic wisdom is fleeting, while tradition and tenacious patience are the forces that endure. The Germans had boasted their ship was unsinkable. The British had simply ensured the laws of naval warfare were upheld.